guys so much for joining tonight. I know that there are a lot of things that you could be doing right now, and just really appreciate you taking an hour out of your night to focus on something that I'm very, very passionate about. And I'm sure if you're on this class, then this is something that you really want to get better at and figure out how do you become more confident and comfortable when you're speaking to a group full of people or even just a couple of people. So no matter what kind of size the room is or the audiences that you're speaking to, I want to give you some tips and tricks so that you feel a lot more confident and comfortable when you're talking at your next presentation. So like I said, this is something I'm really passionate about. I was an awful speaker, really awful speaker for a very long time. And it kind of became my personal mission to set out and improve my own self and figure out what to do. And I took a lot of classes and read a lot of books and got some coaching and things like that. And then I've also been in the very fortunate position for the last 15 years to help companies and individuals really discover and tell their stories with the world and the audiences that they want to connect with. So I'm really excited to take what I learned from both of those experiences and walk you guys through some of that learning so that you can really feel better about your presentations. Now, my whole goal for this is that you are going to walk out with at least 3 really tangible, actionable things that you can apply to your very next presentation so that you feel better and more comfortable and confident connecting with your audience. So to do that, we're going to talk through 5 different areas, and I'm going to share a lot of different suggestions and thoughts within those 5 different areas. And hopefully by the end of this, you're going to walk out with at least 3 tips that you can action in the near term. So with that, let's get started. So the first area that I want to talk about is really about letting your experiences and your passion drive your presentations. And there's some really interesting research that came out a while back. Some of you might have heard about this, that we have 3 different areas that we have to connect with our audiences. And that's visual, vocal, and verbal. So I like to think about this as a toolbox, and I have 3 compartments in that toolbox, and one of them is visual, vocal, and then verbal. And these are a whole series of tools that you can pull out so that you can connect with your audience. So when we're talking about visual, these are things like your eye contact or your hand gestures, your facial expression, your posture, whether or not you smile. If you are in person, maybe if you're on a stage, if you walk around on that stage, or if you're going to stand at a podium, or if you are meeting over Zoom like this, there's still an opportunity to kind of do movement, right, within that window that you're shown in. And these are all ways that we can connect with our audience, because an audience wants to see, hear, and in hearing from 2 different perspectives that we'll talk through, they get your message from a bunch of different ways. And so my hope is that this is comforting to you, that you don't have to have all of your words necessarily perfect, because a lot of how you connect with your audience is actually visual. So they want to see your eye contact. They want to see that your facial expressions and your posture, and you're coming across confident and comfortable and expert in your subject matter. And we just naturally, when we're listening to people speak, we are processing those things in addition to what they're saying from a words perspective and from a vocal perspective to really understand that message that they're trying to get across. So from a vocal perspective, the kind of set of tools that we have is really around volume, right? How loud you speak. Sometimes you want to speak quiet if you're making a particular point, or sometimes I'll use that, especially in a longer presentation, to kind of bring the audience back, because for whatever reason, when people talk really quiet, sometimes we pay attention a little bit more. It's almost like a secret that they're sharing. Also, your intonation. So one of the things that you want to think through when you're practicing speaking is your intonation and how you end your sentences. So if we end our sentences up, that kind of implies a question, right? And if I end my sentence down, that's implying more of that statement or that fact. So you can play with that intonation in your presentations so that you want to vary it a little bit, but you just want to be aware of that. So that's something that the audience is using to connect with you and understand what your message is. The same thing with pace. So how quickly you talk. And sometimes you might want to do a really quick pace. So if you are really excited about a particular point, or the opposite, you might slow down if you're talking about something really technical or really kind of challenging for your audience to understand. So then you can kind of help them by talking a little bit slower. Pauses are also really powerful. So to let people reflect on what you just talked about. Sometimes you can ask a question and give a second to let people think about what their answer would be. And those can be really powerful as we're talking. And then also your cadence. And then from a verbal perspective, this is really the words that we say. And a lot of times when we talk about presenting, this is what everyone gets really nervous about or focuses on. And they think through, what are the slides that I'm going to present, or, what are the words that I'm going to say? And so the verbal, what you really want to watch out for in the kind of message that you're putting together is establishing some common ground, right? So acknowledge that your audience has questions or concerns. If you know what those are, acknowledge them. That can be an incredibly powerful way to open up your presentation. Is if you say something like, if I could see all the thought bubbles for this class, I'm sure that some of you are nervous when you're speaking. I'm sure that some of you, hate doing it and avoid it at all costs. And then there's probably a big part of you that, knows that you have to get better at it because it's how we connect with people and it's how we get our ideas across. So that kind of acknowledging what your audience is probably thinking and feeling and the questions that they have can be really powerful at kind of hooking your audience in and drawing them into your talk or presentation. Also, your expertise. So you want to make sure that you're establishing your expertise really early on. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, kind of my formula for your opening kind of statement or 60 seconds. But you want to somehow work in why people should listen to you and why you're credible about the topic that you're talking about. Whether you've studied something for a while or you have maybe a certification in it, or whatever expertise means for your topic and what you're talking about. We also want to make sure we talk about our main message. So when I opened up our class just now, I said, I want you guys to leave with, at least three really actionable tips that you can implement in your next presentation. And that's really my main message. And so you'll hear me say that throughout the class tonight. And when you're creating your own presentations, I want to make sure that you have a really clear main message that you kind of keep going back to, and you make it really clear what it is that you want people to walk away with. And then, of course, we want to support that. So we're going to have that main message, but then we have to, prove it, right? Or explain it in some way. And that's your supporting messages. And then finally, we're going to talk through at the end some a technique that I really like. It's called bridging, and some of you might be familiar with it. It's a very specific technique to answer audience questions and basically turn them around so that they're at your advantage. So one of the things when I work with people that they get really uncomfortable about or get nervous about is answering questions from the audience because they're not sure what they might get asked, or they don't know quite how to handle them. So I really want to take some time in our class tonight to make sure that you feel really comfortable the next time that you're asked a question, how you can do it and do it really effectively. So this tip again is really about, think about all of these different things that you have in that toolbox of yours to connect with your audience and to get your message across. And that's really what we want to do, right? With any presentation or class or seminar or training or pitch or anything else that we're doing, we just want to connect and get our message across. So these are all of the different ways that we can do that, and they all work together. So like I said, the audience kind of pays attention to this stuff, either consciously or unconsciously, to subconsciously, excuse me, to kind of form an opinion and see, like, is this person credible? Do I believe them? Should I believe what they're asking me to do? All of these factors apply. So if one of these is something that you are really great at, that's really good to know, and that's good to play into that strength. And then if there's something here that's maybe a little bit harder for you, or something that's more challenging, that might be one piece that you could work on in your next presentation or your next several presentations, and just focus on one of these. So maybe you're someone who uses a lot of filler words, and you're like, you know what, next one, I'm just going to try not to use a filler word like or like or something like that. So the next kind of area that I want to talk through is really how you structure and flow the story that you want to tell. And we really want to focus on our goal for the presentation that we're doing. And I do want to take a second to say, when I say presentation, I don't just mean getting up in front of a room full of people and giving a presentation. It could be anything. It could be a team meeting that you're going to have. That's maybe a little bit more informal. It could be a job interview when you are, trying to get across this message about how you're the expert and why they should hire you. It could be maybe you're at the PTO meeting and you are trying to get people to rally behind a certain idea that you have and vote for something that you want the group to do. All of those can be presentations. You could even think about, your next family Zoom call or something like that, or a family gathering. I want us to think really loosely around presentations, because these are all opportunities to get our ideas across and connect with the people that we want. And in any of those situations, there's some goal that you have for participating in it and speaking. So some of the more common types of goals that I have seen are around education. So maybe you are educating people about a topic. So maybe you're doing a lunch and learn, or for whatever reason you're presenting a training, something like that. You are giving some knowledge to the audience. Another common goal would be persuading. So maybe you're trying to get people to, like I said, maybe you're presenting to a PTO and you want them to vote in favor of something that you're pushing. There's a lot of different ways that you could persuade people. Another common goal would be motivating. So you want to motivate your team. You want to motivate your employees. You want to motivate your neighborhood or a group that you're speaking to. You want to get them excited and energized about whatever it is that you're talking about. And then the last one is about taking action. And sometimes when we're presenting, we have a really specific action that we want people to take. So maybe I'm presenting to a group of leaders and I want them to approve my project and approve budget for my project. Or maybe I am pitching a new client and I want them to sign me up for whatever service they need. Maybe I want them to buy my product, whatever that might be. So this kind of tip is really around letting whatever your goal is determine how you structure your whole presentation and your speech and how you think about it and how you think about your audience. And I want to stop really quickly and do a quick exercise just to kind of really bring home what this means. And if you're following along, there's an optional class workbook that we put a link to in the chat. If you don't have it, that's totally fine. You can just use some paper and pen. But want to talk you through a couple of questions so that you can really start to think through how you structure that message and the supporting messages and things like that. So the first question is just really thinking through what's one specific presentation that you have coming up that we can work on during this class. So like I said, let's think broadly about a presentation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be you speaking in front of a large group of people, but it could be a one-on-one with your boss and you want to ask for a promotion. It could be, a team meeting and you're giving an update on a project. It could be doing a pitch to a new client. Whatever kind of upcoming presentation you have that makes sense to you. I just want you to think through one for the purposes of this class, and then you can apply it to other ones. But I think it'll just be easier to kind of hit home on some of these ideas. And then for that presentation that you chose, what's your goal for that? So, I gave 4 common goals of educating, persuading, motivating, or taking action. You might have another one too, right? That's not covered here. But what's that kind of one thing that you really hope to accomplish at the end of that presentation? And sometimes I found people have 2 and they get a little stuck there. I would really encourage you to pick one for the purposes of this kind of exercise. So I might be, let me give you an example. I might have to educate people on a project that I'm working on. And then my goal is for them to take action and approve budget for me to go into phase 2. For the purposes of this exercise, I would really focus on my goal is to get them to approve budget for me to continue on phase 2. And then the kind of how we'll do it, we'll get to. So just take a second, think through what your goal is for whatever presentation you're working on. And then once you have that, I want you to think through, what is my audience already going to know when they walk into that room or when they join that Zoom call? What are the things that they already know? And I can make that assumption. So, the knowledge that they have, that baseline knowledge, how familiar are they with the topic that I'm going to be talking about, or the product I'm working on, or the project, the proposal I'm trying to get through. What does that audience already know coming in that you can just take as a given? So I'll give you a second to think through that. What's your audience already going to know? And then a follow-up question to that are, what are the objections or questions that they're going to have? So we all, especially if it's an area that we know something about, we're all going to come into it with some level of kind of preconceived notions. So are there any objections? Are they going to, is there something that they're going to, what challenges basically are you going to have with your presentation to get them from point A when they walk in to whatever your goal is at the end of it at point B? And just thinking through what questions they're going to have, that can be really powerful too. Sometimes you can answer those questions proactively, and then you kind of erase a lot of anxiety or challenges or anything else that you might have to overcome. So just thinking through what questions they're going to have. And one tip too, depending on what your presentation is, sometimes I've actually kind of done like a poll I call it a poll of the audience. Like I'll pick one or two people who are going to be at the meeting or wherever it is. Obviously that's not always possible, but if it is, and I'll just kind of ask, just really informally, like, what do you already know about this topic? What do you kind of think about it going in? And that can kind of help me understand who my audience is and where they're at from the beginning. And then next, I want you to think through what's in it for your audience. How do we get them to really get engaged in this topic? What's going to motivate them to take action or to be persuaded or to get motivated? What's really in it for your audience? What are they going to get? And if you're stuck here, one of the easiest kind of question that I like to ask myself is, how am I going to make my audience's lives easier, better, or able to do something faster? So easier, better, or faster. So helping think through what is in it for your audience and actually saying that up front, which we'll go through in a second, can be really helpful in really engaging and hooking your audience, especially right now when so much of what we do is on Zoom or virtual meetings, and you run the risk of people multitasking. So if you can hook them from the beginning and give them a reason to listen to you and pay attention to you, you're going to be much more successful. So I'll just give you one more second to kind of wrap up any other thoughts around what your audience is going to know coming in, any objections or questions that you already know they're going to have, and what's in it for your audience. And then the next question is really about your memorable opening. So I said in the beginning, I think the first 60 to 90 seconds of your talk or presentation or speech are really one of the most important. So we want to hook our readers in, or our audience in, excuse me, and we want to give them a reason to listen to us and not flip to email on their phone or anything like that. And so I have 4 kind of pieces that I want you to work into your opening. And I think this can be really effective in almost every presentation or speech or town hall or anything else that I've ever worked on. This has been really effective if you incorporate 4 things into those first 60 to 90 seconds. So the 4 things are, number 1, establishing your credibility. And these can be in any order, by the way. Don't feel like you have to do it in this order, as long as you have these 4 things. But first of all, would be establishing your credibility. Why should the audience listen to you? So, you know, like I said before, maybe that's your credentials. Maybe that's you're certified in something, or maybe you've been studying something for, 15 or 20 years. Or, in some cases you can be credible because you're new to something, depending on what the topic is. But just acknowledge and give your audience the reason why you are an expert. And then secondly, I want you to talk through or acknowledge what is on your audience's minds. So those questions that we just walked through. So acknowledge if there's something, an elephant in the room, so to speak, or if there's something that you can acknowledge and engage your audience in that way. And then third, I want you to talk about your one key takeaway. So what's that one sentence that summarizes what you are hoping people are going to get at the end of this? And I want you to actually say that in the first 60 to 90 seconds. And then finally, I want you to talk through how you're going to organize your talk. So, whether you're going to talk through, 3 different areas or 3 different tips, or I'm going to talk to you about more like chronological, however you're going to structure the talk. I want you just to give a preview of that in those first 60 to 90 seconds. And then finally, I want you to think through what your call to action would be. So this would be something that you want to leave your audience with at the end of a clear action that you want them to take. So, schedule a call with me, or visit this website to learn more, or, buy this product, whatever that might be. and just think through what your call to action would be at the end of your presentation. So I'll just give you a couple more seconds to jot down any notes that you might have on these lines, but the goal of this worksheet is really to help you think through how do you let your goals determine how you structure your message and your story so that you can get your goal at the end of it. So the third tip that I want to talk through is really about slides and using slides. I actually have 2 tips on this. But the first one is about not hiding behind your slides. And this is really about remembering that you are the expert. So you want to put words on your slides, but you don't want everything to be on the slide. So you don't want the kind of presentation to be this, if you could have just emailed the slides to the group that you're presenting to and they would have gotten the same thing as attending the seminar or training or whatever you're putting on. And you want to really step in front of the slides and be the expert and really control the story and the narrative that you're weaving for your audience. And this also helps because you can take advantage of those visual cues. So remember in the beginning, we talked about that toolbox where you have visual, vocal, and verbal kind of tools that you can pull out and use. So you want to make sure that you're using those visual cues whenever you can. So if you are in person with someone in a room, you want to make sure that you step in front of the slides at some point, or you want to put the attention back on you during the presentation so that you can really hit home some of those visual contact or eye contact and hand gestures and smiling and walking and things like that to really drive your point home and emphasize different things. And then similarly, even if you're on Zoom and you are sharing slides, which I think actually does help when you're presenting virtually to have slides and showing slides, you still want to make sure that the slides aren't overwhelming. They should complement you as the speaker and as the expert and the authority in the room. So that's just something to think through for your next presentation if there's going to be slides. And then the kind of fourth tip, also around slides, is sticking to a couple of really powerful ones, and even consider not using slides if that makes sense for the group and the culture of where you're speaking. I know sometimes I say this to folks who work, especially in large companies, and they're like, there's no way, like I have to do slides. And totally get that. I worked for a large company for a long time, totally understand that. I think what I would really encourage you to do, even in that situation, is pick out a couple of powerful slides. And even if you're not doing slides, pick out a couple of powerful talking points that you want to share. Remember that your audience is not going to remember a lot of what you say. They probably are only going to remember about 20% of what you say, at least initially, and then that kind of tapers off as the weeks go by. So don't give them too much clutter, right? We want to really make it simple and focused and clear what it is that we want them to remember in order to hit whatever our goal is for that presentation. So when you really force yourself in terms of preparing your speech or your presentation to really keep it to a couple of slides, that exercise in itself can help you really simplify your message so that you have, again, this kind of key message at the top. And then what are the couple of supporting points that I need to connect with that audience? And sometimes I do recognize that there are situations when you're going to have maybe a lot of data that you have to present, or, I work with some scientists, and they tell me that the kind of source of the data is really important. They have to make sure that their audiences understand that the topic and their talk is based on facts and based on evidence. And that's really important to establishing their credibility. So in that case, maybe it's possible that you can send a full deck out as a pre-read before your talk, or afterward, and say, here's the full details of what we went through. But again, during your actual presentation, I'd really encourage you to really simplify it and stick to a couple of powerful slides and talking points that are going to really hit your message home. So tip number 5 is really about using audience questions to your advantage. And I mentioned this in the beginning. This is something that I'm really passionate about, I think especially because it was an area that was such an opportunity for me personally, as I kind of embarked on this kind of personal quest to become a better speaker and learn everything I could about it. And the idea of audience questions just really scared me for whatever reason. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if they were going to ask me something I didn't know. And I think the more that I've worked with people, I think it's a pretty common fear that we have. And so I want to teach you guys a technique called bridging. And this is really commonly taught during media trainings. So a very specific kind of public speaking or speaking with others would be working with reporters, whether you're being interviewed for, a newspaper or a television piece, or, maybe you're being interviewed for a podcast, something like that, where you're being asked questions. This technique is really commonly used because you want to make sure to answer the question, but then also really make sure you're hitting home your points and getting across your point of view and your perspective on whatever the topic is. So the way that this works, if you follow the graphic that you're seeing, so the audience asks you a question and you answer that question. And that's really important, because if you don't answer a question that you get asked, it can appear like you're hiding something, or you're dodging the question for some reason. So we always want to make sure we answer the question, even if the answer is, I don't know. And we'll talk through that in an example in a second. And then you want to bridge. And a bridge is a bridging statement. So if you just Google like bridging phrases, audience questions or media training bridging questions, you will find lists of probably 100 different bridging phrases. Some of my personal favorites are having said that. I use that one pretty much all the time. You could also use, to summarize though, to get back to what I said before, you can also say, just want to highlight something that I brought up earlier. Anything like that would be considered this kind of bridging phrase or bridging statement. It's a way to bridge from that answer to that question to your key message. And we know what our key messages are because we already walked through kind of what's that kind of key takeaway that we want our audience to walk away with. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you 2 examples. I'll give you a professional one and then a personal one, because I actually practice this quite a bit in my personal life as well. And it's actually been super helpful. So let's say, here, let's use this class as my professional example. Let's say that someone asks me a question, what should I do if I'm speaking to a group where their language does not match my own, right? So if I'm speaking, English is my primary language, if I'm speaking to a group of non-English speakers, what do I have to think about? What do I have to keep in mind? So my answer would be, I'm really glad you asked that question. There's actually a couple of things that we want to think through when we're talking to non-native speakers of the language that we speak. For example, they're probably going to be a little bit more comfortable reading versus hearing. So in that case, I would actually put more words on your slide rather than less. It might also behoove you to do a pre-read if you can do that. And share the message in advance, and that gives them a little bit more time to process the information and understand it, so that when you present it, they might have an easier time following along. Things like that, right? So I would keep going and answering the question, and then I would go back to my bridging statement, and I would say, Having said all of that, one of the key points that I really want you guys to take away tonight is that you have this toolbox with 3 different compartments of tools, so visual, vocal, and verbal. So keeping in mind that the kind of verbal, the words that I'm saying might not be as clear to someone who doesn't speak the same language, I really want to make sure I'm really dialed into my vocal and my verb and my visual cues. So I want to really use hand gestures to emphasize points that I want to make. I want to make sure that I'm talking slowly and at a really, maybe a little bit louder than I normally would, just to make sure that it's really easy to hear what I have to say. And as you're speaking in front of any audience, you just want to keep in mind those visual, vocal, and verbal cues, and you can kind of play with them to match the audience that you're speaking to. So I hope that makes sense. So I answered the question, and then I bridged, right? And then I gave my key message, or one of the points that I really want to get across to you guys. So that's one example. I'll give you a personal example too. You can use this at all points in your life. I've used it quite a bit, like I said. So there was one instance where my mother-in-law came over and she made a comment about my house not being as clean as it probably could be. And so I answer the question, right? And I say, yeah, you're probably right. It's probably not as clean as it could be. Having said that, I've been really, focusing time on spending with my kids. And to me, that's really important right now. So I'm okay if the dishes are in the sink, but I had a chance to play dress up with the girls or something like that. But again, so I'm answering the question, but then I'm bridging to get at some key point that I want to make so that I'm able to get my perspective across in a way that, honors the question and honors the kind of message that they're trying to get across to me, while at the same time providing my perspective. So I hope that makes sense. I'm happy to answer any questions about this technique. But like I said, I think this is really powerful. I think you can practice it all the time. You can use it in a lot of different ways. And you can find a couple of bridging statements that really feel authentic and true to you. Like I said, having said that is probably the one that I use most frequently. It just really resonates with me. But there are 100 of other ones. In the workbook, and that link that is in the chat, there's a list of a couple of them in there, or you can just try Googling and you'll find a bunch of other ones. And the other point that I want to make about audience questions before we move on is that the other real golden opportunity about them is that it's a way to really gauge where your audience is at. So if my goal for a presentation is I want to get budget approval on something, and someone in my audience, asks me a really basic question about something I answered or I talked about, 20 minutes ago, that's really helpful information for me to have, because it means that the audience is not with me yet, right? I have to go back and really hit home some of those early points before I can bring them along to get approval for the budget. Very similar if you're educating somebody on, you're doing a training or something like that, and you're educating people on a topic. If you're getting questions about things that you spoke about in the very beginning, that might be an indication that you have to slow down, or maybe you have to do a little bit more check-ins and say, does this make sense before I move on? Things like that. So it's a really helpful way to really gauge your audience and understand where they're at, where their heads are at, how much more you have to do in order to accomplish your goal for that presentation or talk. So with this in mind, I want to just take a couple of minutes to let you guys think through that presentation that you identified before as what you want to think through for this class. What is a question or two that you might get that you can kind of practice this technique? And I have a couple of the examples of bridging phrases here. So I'd also like to add that, or just to put this in some context, or to put this in perspective. Before we leave this topic, let me add, here's the real problem. That can be really powerful too. Let me share again. As I said before, it all boils down to this. What is most important to know is, and it's also important to remember. So these are just a couple of examples that you can think through what makes sense. But I just want to give you guys a couple of minutes to really think through what is a question or two questions or three questions that you might get at that presentation that you're thinking of that you could apply this technique. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes really to do this. And then if you have any questions as we're going through, feel free to pop them into the chat or the Q&A box, and I can answer them and I can help you. But just going to give you a couple minutes to go through this. And while you guys are doing this too, I had promised that I would explain how you could use this if you don't know the answer to a question or if you don't have it right in front of you. So while you guys are thinking through this, I'll just talk this through for anyone who needs it. One of the things that I think helps to reinforce your credibility is when you do respond that you don't know when you don't know. And so what I mean by that is if you are asked a question about a specific number or a specific piece of data or something like that, or where does this research come from, something like that, I think it's okay for you to say, you know what, I don't have that right in front of me, but I can get that for you afterward. Having said that, the main point of the conversation or the main theme from that data is blah, blah, blah. I think it's okay to acknowledge if you don't have something right in front of you. I think it helps to reinforce that you're credible, that, we're all human. We don't expect everyone to have all of the answers. And I think it can really help drive that point home. And I think it's perfectly fine for you to admit that you don't have an answer right in front of you. So I hope that helps.
Yes, there is one comment in the Q&A box. Says bridging phrases would be excellent for points of clarification for very technical or multifaceted scripts.
Yes, thank you, Leslie, and thank you for posting that. Anytime that you're doing something really technical, I think the more that you repeat the main message that you want to give, I think the better. So I 100% agree with that. I think anytime you can use these bridging techniques to reinforce those key points, I think is a huge win. So I 100% agree. Thank you for sharing that. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on. But if anyone has any other questions about this, please put it into the chat or the Q&A. I also wanted to just take a minute or two and acknowledge that we are in a virtual world right now and talk through how can you be a virtual rock star when you're presenting. So thinking through those visual, vocal, and verbal toolboxes that we have, how do we really enhance that in a visual environment or in a virtual environment? So from a visual perspective, you want to make sure that you are set up in the right kind of room. So look at lighting and play around with different lighting. You can put lamps places. A lot of people are doing ring lights right now, which are the kind of lights that are literally a circle or a ring that go right behind your computer, and that can help kind of put some light on you. You can think through the background. So I think a lot of people look at the backgrounds of the people who are presenting. I'm sure that you have noticed that I have wood paneling in my background, which ironically is one of the first things that I was going to change when we bought this house, and it's actually going to become one of the last, but that's okay. But I think your backgrounds kind of can say a lot about who you are and can add to your presentation. So just kind of take all of that in mind. The other thing from a visual perspective, I actually prefer, even when I'm on Zoom, I'd actually prefer to be standing versus sitting down, because you move differently when you're standing. If you do sit at a chair, so like right now I'm sitting, you want to make sure that you have at least your fist of space between your back and the back of the chair. And the reason for that is a couple of fold. So number one, let me just do this really quick. So if I did this, you kind of tend to slouch a little bit, and it just sets a different tone. So it can look like you're not quite as engaged, or you can seem a little bit further away. So by sitting kind of up with a little bit of space between you and the back of the chair, it actually makes a huge difference. It also prevents you from putting your elbows on the table, which is another thing that people tend to do without even thinking about it. And if you put your elbows on the table, you might do this, or you might do this, something that's gonna hurt your ability to really visually connect with your audience. And when we're presenting virtually and you're in a box this big, you want to make sure that you are coming across the most effective way that you can. You can also use hand gestures. So to emphasize different points, obviously you want to do it kind of in your space, and you can practice with that, but it can be really helpful in terms of Zoom calls or WebEx or Teams or whatever platform you use. From a vocal perspective, you want to make sure that you are speaking in a loud enough tone that people can hear you clearly. So maybe you want to try different microphones or different rooms in your house. So for example, in my house, one of my rooms, for whatever reason, has a huge echo that I never realized before this year. But so I avoid that one whenever I am presenting online, because people just have a harder time hearing. Or if I am in that room, then I definitely use a headset so that people can really clearly understand what it is that I'm saying. And then from a verbal perspective, I think I've already mentioned this, but when you're presenting online, I do think that's a time when you can use slides a little bit more to kind of keep people interested and really hit home some of your points, and put your main message and your key takeaway and put all of that onto the slide so that people can see that, and it's another way for them to understand it and get it. So happy to talk through any other specific questions if you guys have about virtual presentations, but those are just a couple of extra things to think about, just to make sure that you're coming across the best you can from a visual, vocal, and verbal perspective. So just want to summarize really quickly what we talked through in terms of those kind of 5 tips or areas. And the first one is all about connection. So how do we connect with our audience using that toolbox of visual, vocal, and verbal cues that we have? And again, this is all about connecting with the audience so that we are showing how confident we are and how passionate we are and how knowledgeable we are about the topic. And then secondly, we talked about defining that goal that we have for the presentation and using that goal to help us structure how we're going to tell that story and how we're going to get people from point A when they walk in the room to point B when they walk out of the room, whether that's virtual or in person. Third, we talked about standing out. So don't hide behind your slides, or if you're playing a video or anything else that you might have, there's a visual kind of aid. We want to make sure that we're standing out as the presenters. We are the experts in the room. We are there for a reason. We are the ones that people are there to see and hear from. So making sure that we stand out and we don't hide behind slides or anything else. And then fourth, we talked about focus. So how do we clearly and simply tell the message that we want to tell so that we can make that connection with the audience and get them to do the goal that we have for it? And really focusing on, what's our main message, and then what are those couple of supporting points that we need to say that are really going to resonate with our audience and achieve what we are hoping to achieve. And then finally, we talked about interaction and talking with our audience and using those audience questions to our advantage. And specifically, we talked through the bridging technique and answering those questions, but then bridging it back to a main message that we want to make sure that we're really driving home, or clarifying if the question is telling us that our audience is confused about something, really bridging back to clarify what it is that we want to share. So with that, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to see if there's any questions that you guys want to talk through. But I also just want to say thank you. I am really, again, I said this in the beginning, but I know you guys have so many different things that you could be doing with an hour of your time, and just really appreciate you taking it to talk about something and work on something that I am so incredibly passionate about. And this is a particular skill that there is no finish line. There is no, oh, I finally am a good presenter. It's something you're going to constantly be working on. And that list in the beginning of those visual, vocal, and verbal cues is a really great place to start for, I'm going to work on this one right now, or I'm going to work on this one right now. And just keep refining and keep getting better. I wanted to share my contact information as well, in case